Hi guys, it's Mark Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, also Mark Zicree of Space Command, and many other things. And I've just gotten back from the Cardiff International Film Festival, where Elaine and I were judges and speakers and panelists and so forth, and also the Northeast Star Trek Convention in Albany, New York, where I was flown to be a speaker. And at both of these things, we showed the first half hour of the Space Command pilot, which we're ongoingly working on, as well as getting ready to show the entire first hour of the 2-hour pilot at the C21 Drama Summit in London at the end of November in London. And as I just said, in London, twice Department of Redundancy Department. So, and I know I've been doing the history of science fiction books, and shortly I'll be doing the history of science fiction films, thence the history of science fiction radio and television series. But before I move on from books, I want to talk about two things about science fiction books that I love and that I really haven't touched on. And they're interconnected, and I have a great story to tell you about what I've been up to that will illustrate all of this. So, and again, for those of you who grew up in the internet age, where probably some of you are buying books pretty much solely on the internet and perhaps reading them solely on Kindle, and that's all fine because it allows you to take, a library's worth of books in your pocket, essentially, and that's a good thing. And there's audiobooks, and I love Audible, and there's a library thing now where you can actually check out audio library books and Kindle library books, thousands of them just with your phone, which I've been utilizing and I very much love, and it allows you to sample a lot of authors and really have a great time. But when I was a kid, it was a totally different experience, of course. And so you had basically two kinds of books, and only two kinds of books, really. Books that you could check out from the library, and we had school libraries when I was in elementary school and junior high and high school. And fortunately, as I've said before, they stocked the Heinlein juveniles, some of which are behind me, and I loved those, and that led me to Heinlein's adult books. And then you had new and used bookstores, and some of these were small, and some of them were big, and some of them were well stocked, and some of them were badly stocked or badly organized. But I grew up with an enormous love of used bookstores. And the great thing about bookstores, and it's something that I love, I carry to this day, is that when you're online, you either find the specific thing you're looking for, or you browse and you happen upon things online, or they decide what you might like and they send you kind of like, hey, if you like this, you might like that. In a bookstore, you can come upon things you never knew you'd like, you never knew was out there. And sometimes if it's a used bookstore, this may be the only time you ever find it. Or sometimes you're looking for a book and it's years before you find it. Or you find things you've never seen before, in permutations you've never seen before. And I love that quality of book hunting, and I'm a huge devotee and fan of used bookstores and antiquarian bookstores. Now, the difference between a used bookstore and antiquarian bookstores deal often with older, often with collectible books. Sometimes their prices are higher, usually, but you can still find amazing bargains. So what I wanted, and then the other thing I didn't mention was my love of book covers. I love book illustrations and book covers, as many of you know, and particularly the science fiction paperbacks of the 1950s are a huge delight of mine. There were several artists who were the predominant artists at that time. One was Richard Powers, and he did very kind of expressionistic and impressionistic, strange, abstract, semi-abstract paintings for a number of books like Childhood's End, etc. And then there was Ed Emshwiller, whose designs were actually utilizing in Space Command, and again, he was more of a realist, but still extremely cool and prolific, and I love his work, and he signed his work Emsh, E-M-S-H, which was the shortening of his name, Emshwiller. Okay, so that's the prelude to all of this. And of course, if you've looked at my bookcase, you know exactly what I'm into. Now, I've been going back and forth to England and to London about 10 times in the last 2 years because we're doing the feature there with Lord Peter Hayne, and I've been doing a ton of stuff there and meeting with the networks and so forth, going to conferences, and I love England. But years and years and years ago, first of all, when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, actually, there was a TV show that debuted on CBS in the summer, and they only aired 17 episodes. They actually made 18, but one wasn't even aired until later. and it was called The Prisoner. Now, it starred a wonderful actor named Patrick McGowan, who he had starred in a TV show called, in England it was called Danger Man, and here it was called Secret Agent, and it has a great theme song, Secret Agent Man, which you may have heard. And it was sort of a more or less straight spy drama by way of England. And but then Patrick McGowan did a very strange TV show called The Prisoner. And The Prisoner was, and we'll talk about this when we get into the history of science fiction film and TV. But The Prisoner was a great show, and Patrick McGowan was astonishing in it. And it was shot in a little Welsh village called Portmeirion. That's extremely eccentric. And again, I'll get into that more when we talk about TV shows. But Elaine and I, some years ago, went to Portmeirion for vacation, and it was wonderful. And they had a prisoner shop that sold items from the Prisoner TV show reproductions. And but nearby, there was a town called Hay on Wye, and it was the Wye River, so it's Hay on Wye, and different from Ham on Rye, and it was primarily a town made up of bookstores, used bookstores. And I was only able to go there for a short while, and it was absolutely wonderful. They had one store that just sold old editions of Dickens, and I actually bought a first edition of David Copperfield that's up there somewhere. But I've been wanting to go back to Hay and Wye forever, but it's, in terms of public transit, it's very difficult. You have to take a train and a bus and all sorts of stuff, and it takes 5 hours to get there from anywhere, unless you have a car, and then it's an hour and a half, 2 hours. But particularly when you're exhausted, as I have been lately, because I've been pushing so hard, I didn't really want to try driving on the wrong side of the street, because when you're tired, it's never a good idea to drive at all. But finally, and when I went to the Welsh Film Festival, the last few days, I had a day off, and I decided to treat myself to a day at Hay on Wye. We rented a cab and went from Cardiff to Hay on Wye. It was about an hour and a half drive, and then spent about 4 hours there. Not nearly enough, and 4 or 5 hours. And I only managed to get to 3 bookstores in all of that time. And I went with Kasturi, who, as you know, is one of our actresses in Space Command and production supervisor on the show. And Elaine was back in Cardiff working on tightening the screenplay, The Subversive, that she's writing based on Lord Peter Haynes' memoir about his apartheid-era activist parents. And so she has just sent off. Yay! She's just sent it off. And our producing partners put on the film festival in Wales. And next year we're going to add a 2-day science fiction film festival to that film festival that I'll be curating. So it's going to be really fun. But anyway, Hay on Wye. So I go to Hay on Wye, and a dream, and I've actually had dreams like this. I mean, real dreams when I was asleep, where you would find a bookstore that you'd never been in, and it would be filled with wonderful, inexpensive books that you had never seen before, and you would just be buying these books and reading them and just having an amazing time. So that's what Hay on Wye was like that day. And it was just wonderful. And I'm going to share the books I got from there, because many of them I'd never seen before. Many of them were in great condition. And I'll just walk you through what happened, because it was so fun. And but again, it's sort of like it was just such a treat. And if you're ever in the UK, go to Hay on Wye. You'll find it just wonderful, just a book lover's delight. So essentially, got off the cab, and there was a bookstore, a little old used bookstore. Now, when I was a kid, my mom used to take me to used bookstores, and you could find books, science fiction paperbacks for a dime, and comic books for a dime or a nickel. They were all used, and most of my collection was made up of those books that I bought when I was a kid. And so many of the books I've been showing you from on the Mr. Sci-Fi History of Books were from that collection, were from books that I bought when I was a kid. But, so we're in Hay on Wye, and I say to the owner, do you have a science fiction section? And she sends me to the back of the bookstore. Now, first of all, a good science fiction section is alphabetical, and it's, and ideally it has older books. Particularly, as I said, my focus is books from the 50s, because I love that period, because it was so optimistic, and it was Heinlein and Asimov and Bradbury and all these other writers I've been talking about, and they were writing in very much a shared universe of landing on the moon, colonizing Mars, jumping to the stars, etc. And that led to the space program, and it's led to and now Elon Musk is very much bringing that alive again, and movies like The Martian are too, and Space Command is too. So the first inkling I had that there was going to be something wonderful was I found two comic books that were just great, and I will show them to you. And I bought them, and the prices, by the way, of everything were great. The paperbacks were generally £2 to £3, which is about, $2.50 to $3 or $4. I mean, really cheap, considering that on eBay many of these books would go for $20, $30 or more. Okay, so here's the first thing I found was this, which is in the 1950s, Walt Disney did a series of science fiction specials on his Disneyland TV show, and he'd often have Werner von Braun come on, who was a NASA scientist and also developed the V1 and the V2 rockets for the Nazis prior to that. But this is Mars and Beyond, and it was a terrific TV show. And this is a rarity. This is the comic book tie-in, and this is the British edition of the comic book tie-in, but it was also published in America, and it's just great, just great. And then the other comic book they had, again, another super rarity, is this, which is, you can see Life Beyond the Earth. And again, very cool, wonderful illustration. You can see Mars. So they're obviously on one of the moons of Mars. And just gorgeous and very, very fun. And then I just started going through the books that they had, and I found a few books that I bought. And it was just terrific. And then I went to another bookstore and found a few more that I bought, just a couple, two, three. But then I hit the mother lode. So I went to a third bookstore. I was running out of time. I only had a few more minutes. The cab was going to be coming to take me back. And I went to the third bookstore, which they'd recommended to me. Because at the first bookstore, I said, what are the other bookstores here that have science fiction? And they directed me to this one. And it was... I went, and they had a very good science fiction section, and I pulled out a couple of paperbacks, but they'd also had a collectibles section. And I found a book there that was this, and this is Dan Dare, was a comic strip in the newspapers in England, and it was beautifully illustrated and beautifully designed. It started in the 1950s, though it's continued, I think, even to this day, really. And I'll show you, but the illustrations were very, 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 very evocative and very sort of very much the Space Command retro feel. And I bought this pretty much to use as a reference for Space Command to show some of our artists sort of the aesthetic we have in mind. And but this is an overview of the history of Dan Dare. And they also have a radio show of Dan Dare that you can find on the BBC app. And it's just very, very fun. Dan Dare, Pilot of the Future, Dan Dare. So I bought that. And then I looked at this science fiction section, pulled out a couple things to buy. Time was running out, only a few more minutes left. And then I went back to but in the science fiction section, it said if you're looking for collectible science fiction, go to our collectibles section. So I went back to the collectibles section, into the very rear room of it, and there were these two middle-aged British guys, very bookish. Book people look a certain way. Book people look a very certain way, and I said, do you have any collectible science fiction? And they said, well, not much. They said, and then he said, well, actually, an old guy just sold us his collection. And I said, well, what was it made up of? And he said, well, it was several thousand paperbacks from classic paperbacks and several thousand science fiction magazines. I said, wow. And I said, have you put that out yet? And he said, no, we haven't even gone through it yet. We haven't had a chance to go through it. And I said, well, has any of it been put out? I said, yeah. Well, we've put out the paperbacks. We've put out the paperbacks. We haven't had a chance to go through it. And again, this is like, wow. And so two possibilities emerge. One is I've already looked at them if they were put with the general stock. I said, well, where were they put? And he said, oh, we put them with new arrivals. And so I said, well, can you show me where that is? So he leads me downstairs. And again, I'm almost out of time. My heart is racing. And he leads me to the opposite side of the store from where the science fiction section was. And there's the new arrivals section, and one wall of bookshelves is filled with these books, and it goes to the opposite wall, the other side of those shelves, and it's thousands and thousands and thousands of, and this guy kept them in plastic for the most part, and they are gorgeous, and many of them I've never seen a copy of this before. They're mostly from the 50s, and so I just start crazily going through it to see what I can find, because my time is up. There's a cabbie waiting for me on the other side of town, and and Castoria is waiting for me too. so I know that the longer I wait, the more hot water I'm getting in. But so let me show you some of the books that I found in these bookstores. So and I'll start just now. A few of them were from the other bookstores. Like for instance, this is a very cool 1960s edition paperback of Dune. This is the British edition, and you can see they have spice eyes. Interestingly enough, this was used as a cover for a different book in America by a different author, and sometime I have that in my collection somewhere, so I'll show it to you at some other time. But and that's another interesting phenomenon of books that have covers that were used for other books, and we'll get into that sometime too. But and the British book covers, by the way, are very beautifully done often, and that's really a cool book. And then and I also found every now and then I buy a book that isn't science fiction, so I found this really cool movie tie-in edition of Ben-Hur, again from the 50s, really cool Charlton Heston cover, really great shape. And again, these are all just very inexpensive. But then I found the British edition of The Demolished Man, really cool, Alfred Bester. And then, let's see, I'm just going to go in no particular order with this stuff. Here's Neville Shute, On the Beach. This is when we were talking about After the Bomb stories, there were two kinds. There were kinds that were written in the genre by writers like, Lee Brackett, and I mean pretty much every science fiction writer wrote After the Bomb stories. Heinlein did it with I think it's Farnham's Freehold, and Ray did it, and Ted did it with Ted Sturgeon did it with, I think, Thunder and Roses and so forth. But there were also mainstream writers writing After the Bomb stories. And this is probably the most famous one, On the Beach by Neville Shute, who was a very popular Australian writer, and it came out in the 50s, and 1958. This is the first edition, and it was made into a movie with Gregory Peck and Fred Astaire and Ava Gardner, and it's a very good film and a very good novel, but extremely depressing. But and then let's see what also I found. This is a really cool thing. Sometimes I like to collect the same editions, variant editions of the same book. And so this is the current, if you went into England and bought the current paperback of The Forever War by my teacher, Joe Haldeman, who I've named a general after in Space Command, it looks like this, sort of cyberpunk and green and kind of, hip and edgy. But I also found this earlier edition, which is the same cover with a more normal landscape, which I actually prefer this version to this. But you can see that it's the same illustration, but with a very different palette. Isn't that interesting? So I'm going to have Joe sign these, and really cool. He's a great guy. If you haven't met him, definitely look him up when he's at a convention. And but then I found this, Christopher Priest, The Space Machine, which is a sequel to The Time Machine, which is very, very fun. Christopher Priest also did a book series that was made into a TV series in England called Tripods, that was pretty much about Martian walking machines and an alien invasion, and kids who fight back. But this is very, very fun. And we'll talk soon about sequels to books by other writers, and that's another subject we'll get into in a Mr. Sci-Fi soon. But then we get to the collection of this guy who had these amazing books. So, for instance, here's the British paperback edition of Starship Troopers. I've never seen this book before. Look at how fun that is. Very cool. And then let's see what else we have in here. There's a lot of books. I bought a lot of books. So then here we have, this is the British edition of The Puppet Masters. Again, first British paperback edition. Never seen that cover. Really a cool cover. Very much like Richard Powers. May even be by Richard Powers, for all I know. And I can research that. And then let's see what else we have here in the grab bag. Amazing stuff. Okay, Green Hills of Earth by Heinlein. Another very, very cool cover. And again, this is the British edition. Very fun. Never saw that before. Most of these I never saw before. This is Escape to Venus by S. Makepeace Lott. And it's got a great, great female spacesuit. And we're going to be having the spacesuit contest soon. And that one certainly would qualify as remarkable. And, again, you can see how cool that is. And then here's a great edition of Childhood's End. This is the first British edition. And it's just a very evocative cover, which I really love. And then this is The Door into Summer, an edition of Robert Heinlein's book. And again, this is the British edition. I've never seen this cover, and it's very fun and again very different for a science fiction book to have this kind of sexy cheesecake kind of cover. And then here's another great cover, the British edition of The Currents of Space. These are all 1950s paperbacks, and you can see the idea was, hardcovers tended to have more refined covers, and those were more respectable. They got the reviews, whereas the paperbacks, because they were smaller and you'd see them on a news rack and they were competing for your eyeballs, generally they'd have more lurid covers. Victim of a psychic probe, it says on the back, and oddly enough, that's got a photograph. So who knows what that thing is? But it's like, oh my gosh, victim of a psychic probe. Okay, terrific. And then we get to E Pluribus Unicorn by Theodore Sturgeon, my old teacher and mentor and friend. And you can see it's a strange and moody cover. He's much more of a psychological kind of science fiction writer. And this is sometimes they would like have books almost be look like mainstream books. This is Nerves by Lester Del Rey. It's about an accident in a nuclear power plant decades before 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl, and it's a cover by Richard Powers. Even though so this is actually an American edition, Ballantine Books, and it's interesting as Richard Powers primarily does kind of abstracts, but you can see he did a very realistic doctor in the foreground. So that's really a fun book. And then we have Pilgrimage by Zena Henderson. Now Zena Henderson was one of the few female writers of science fiction of that era who used her name, her real name. And this is I recommend these. These are books of a group called The People, and they sort of live almost like Amish people, but they have psychic powers, and they're fun. They're really good stories and interconnected stories about those people. Then there's this wonderful book of All Possible Worlds by William Tenn, and that's much more a typical kind of Richard Powers cover, which you can see sort of semi abstract, where there's a spaceship and a spaceman, but also these weird shapes. And then we have Destination Universe by A.E. Van Vogt. And again, these are cool. And again, these writers, I mean, the writers were very much of the community of the artists and the editors and the publishers. They all knew each other. They'd all go to conventions. And even the British contingent, read and knew the American contingent. This is the British paperback first edition of Sirens of Titan by Vonnegut. Again, I've never seen this book. It's really cool. And that's, of course, when Vonnegut was being packaged. He started to be packaged as sort of a science fiction, but also a mainstream writer. Kind of, this is a transitional thing where it says this wild and cruelly satiric fantasy about mankind in the nightmare age can only be described as electrifying, a science fiction novel of staggering originality and fabulous imagination. So, and it's corgi science fiction. So it's being packaged as science fiction, and they're describing it not on the back cover. They describe it on the back cover as well, but here on the front cover, on the idea that maybe people had never heard of Vonnegut might be drawn in by the description as well as by the illustration. And then this is a book by Frederick Pohl and Jack Williamson, who also wrote on their own and also collaborated with other writers. And this is Star Child, and it's kind of sexy and interesting. And there was another cover similar to a novel by John Wyndham called Chalky, and I think it's the same artist. And this is, again, a Ballantine book, so it's the American edition. Sometimes the American editions would just be repriced and sold in England. And then this is Nonstop by Brian Aldiss, which is a great cover of a guy sort of flying on an out-of-control flying saucer. I believe this is an Ed Emshwiller cover, and it's just, swell in every way, and just, so... And let's see what else we have in here. Okay, so here's The War Against the Roll by A.E. Van Vogt. So really fun with a guy in space and a spacesuit, and and again, never saw this edition before. This is the Silver Locust. This is the first paperback edition of the Martian Chronicles in England, and it has a story that wasn't in the American edition, that was censored in the American edition, called The Fire Balloons, which is about a priest who tries to find a way of preaching the gospel to these alien creatures that look like balloons, and to find something that will convey Jesus that isn't a representation of him as a human. And it's a really good story, and it was years later that story was included in the American editions of the Martian Chronicles, and it was called The Silver Locust rather than the Martian Chronicles. And the Silver Locust basically refers to the fleet of spaceships of the colonists who come to Mars and colonize it, that it's like locusts. And so then this is A.E. Van Vogt, The Voyage of the Space Beagle. And this is a book that when Aliens came out, they sued. A.E. Van Vogt sued, claiming that some of the ideas had come from this book, and he won, and he was given or whether he sued or threatened to sue, he was given a payment, paid off. And but this is about a monster that gets loose on a spaceship. And I haven't read this one yet, but I've heard it's really, really good. And let's see what else we have in here. Ooh, this is this is, of course, like, the end of the world stories, which are wonderful, wonderful. And this is called The Cataclysm. And you can see that London is being washed away by water, and there's a bus, a double-decker bus being washed away. And, again, the cover art, who knows if the book is good, but the cover art is certainly great. And let's see what else we have in here. Okay, this is No Man Friday which is Last Man on Mars, a man marooned on Mars, and it's sort of like Robinson Crusoe on Mars, which was again, there was a movie of that name not derived from this book, but then also The Martian has the same notion, and so it's fun to see, and you can see it's a very interesting spacesuit here, and again, we'll be having our spacesuit contest soon. I'll be announcing that, and then of course here's Foundation by Isaac Asimov. That is a Richard Powers cover, and this is the British edition, and it's really cool looking, and that's a great one of the famous trilogies that Asimov wrote. That's gone down as one of the great works of science fiction. Then here's another Asimov book, Earth is Room Enough, a collection of short stories all set on Earth, and you can see there's a spaceship and Earth and the moon. And again, this is the British edition. And it's lovely when you're a collector and you find things you've never seen before that you didn't know existed, and that's the great love. And you can see they're all in plastic. They're all from this one guy's collection, and and that's not all of them. We'll get to the last few when we're getting down to the bottom. This is The World in Peril by Charles Chilton. This was the third series in Journey into Space, which is one of my favorite things in the world. Journey into Space was a British radio show written and produced by Charles Chilton. And it's the first one is a journey to the moon, the second one is a journey to Mars, and then the third one is going back to Earth from Mars to warn that there's an invasion coming. And these are the novelizations, and they're just wonderful. He's a wonderful writer. I highly recommend the radio shows. You can find them online, and they were a huge inspiration to many astronomers, many scientists, particularly in England. And so here's The Tide Went Out by Charles Eric Maine, and again, this is another end of the world story, again with very evocative, a novel for adult minds only. Look at that. Well, then I probably shouldn't read it, but but it's cool, really cool. So we're getting to the bottom of the bag now, getting toward the bottom. Let's see what else we have here that's incredibly wonderful and cool. So what's next? It's like Christmas Day for me. Okay, so this is Address Centauri by F.L. Wallace. And this is a Galaxy science fiction novel. So this is a British, this was sold in Britain, but it's an American book. And the cover, some of you may recognize, is by Wally Wood. Now, he wasn't a well-known cover artist in books, but he was a great artist in EC Comics and Weird Science, which we talked about a little bit before. And so it's really fun to see him as a cover artist doing something different. And is credited as Wallace Wood, not Wally Wood on the book. So. And then this is a great cover. This is This Fortress World by James E. Gunn, and this is an ace double. So there's The 13th Immortal by Robert Silverberg, who we talked about a little bit before. He was a pal of Harlan Ellison's, and I just saw him at the Worldcon and got a book autographed by him. I should get this one autographed by him. But you can see it's a great robot and carrying an unconscious guy. Usually it would be an unconscious girl, which would have been a better idea probably. And it says Fugitive from Utopia. Now, one problem with these books, of course, is that they're so fragile that reading them essentially destroys them when they're this old. And so usually what you do is you either get a copy that you can read that you don't mind if you destroy it, or there's a later edition you can buy, or a hardcover. The hardcovers are far more durable. And sometimes you can read a book and you won't destroy it. It just depends on the condition it's in. So then here's a collection by Donald Walheim, and he later had his own publishing company called DAW Books, D-A-W Books, which were his initials. But he was also a science fiction book editor, and this is End of the World, and you can see the Earth is blowing up. And this is another great Ed M. Schwiller cover, and he was very prolific. And then this is yet another great Ed M. Schwiller cover. This is Recruit for Andromeda by Milton Lesser. And this is not a well-known science fiction name in books, but when we get to X-1 and Dimension X, there were a couple of guys who adapted those stories wonderfully to radio, and Milton Lesser was one of those guys. And again, this is a wonderful cover, and it's an ace double, so we have this cover on the flip side. So now we get to the last one that I bought. I think that's it. Yep. And this is Starways, and that's by Poul Anderson, another classic and very famous science fiction writer. It's another cover by Ed M. Schwiller. And many of these covers, by the way, are not signed and they are not credited, usually on the inside of the book, but you can recognize certain telltale artist tricks or styles, and you can start to recognize who's doing what. Ed M. Schwiller was extremely prolific, and then he became a filmmaker and had a second career in which he was extremely notable. So that's it. Those are the ones that I bought, and as I mentioned, I stayed at the Future Inn, so you can see the Future Inn. I was staying in the future, yay! And perfect for me, of course. So that's it. And so in the next Mr. Sci-Fi, we'll be talking about books written, sequels written by other writers to famous books. We'll get into that, and we'll be announcing the details of the spacesuit contest. And it's going to be lots of cool stuff ahead. We're going to be doing more with Space Command, lots to tell you about, lots of fun, and many adventures to come. So thanks very much, and we'll talk to you all again very, very soon. Bye-bye, guys.